At the same time, we did not want to fit into the list of
Oh, you
LGBTQIA,
can't, you don't say.
etc.,
Oh,
because we did not want to be treated as an
you
identity.
don't say.
But why? What remains this resistance to identity?
Indeed.
Well,
Actually,
on the one hand, we accepted that
let's pause there. Let's pause there. Do you guys know the answer to that question? Why do queer Marxists resist identity? Why do queer Marxists resist the idea of identity? Queer Marxists are vehemently opposed to identity politics. Now, conservatives don't know this because they believe that liberals and progressives are the same as queer Marxists. They're not in any way. The people who introduced identity politics are not queer Marxists. They were always opposed to that. They were always opposed to gay marriage from the very beginning. So why are they opposed to identity? Because identity means that you have categories. Categories means that you have oppression and hierarchy. Exactly. Identity leads to categorization, which leads to hierarchy. These are collectivists. These are Marxists. Identity creates a hierarchy, which leads to inequities. Very good. Identity is property, and having property creates inequity. Inequity, not inequality. Inequity. We have to be careful about that. Identity forms hierarchies. They want no differences between anyone, no hierarchies. If there are no categories, if there are no differences, then there's no hierarchies. There's no oppression. Identity is about individualism, and socialists think in terms of the collective. Yup, it's normative, upholding capitalism. Yup, opposed to labeling or categories. Exactly. It's been used as a hierarchical delineator. Exactly. Marxism is about getting rid of hierarchies. Hierarchies mean someone has more resources than you have. What they want to do in getting rid of identity, they say if we have identity, we have categories. And if we have categories, there's inevitably going to be people in one category that have more than people in another category. So when we're talking about equity, what we're talking about is flattening all hierarchies, making everything the same. The same means no categories, no identities. The minute you have identity is the minute that you have categories. Judith is, yes, an identity. This is also true. Your identity, your category is forced on you by capitalism because capitalism created the social construct of the category in the first place. That's what they believe about men and women. And I promise you, Judith is way more into this gender nihilist stuff than she lets on in these. Judith is like, in these interviews, she's like, we just don't like identity politics. Okay, what Judith is talking about is gender nihilism. She's talking about a gender accelerationism. We've read and are continuing to read gender accelerationist and gender nihilist documents. We know where Judith's ideas come from, but Judith has just this way of just smoothing it over. We just don't want identity politics. Well, why, Judith? Why? We don't see queer as an identity. Well, why? Because you don't want identities to exist.
resistance to identity. Well, on the one hand, we accepted that sexuality and identification were complex, and that sometimes a life story cannot be adequately represented by an identity category. For some people, sexual orientation changes over time. For others, gender changes. We want to think about gendered and sexual lives in time and in space, sometimes staying very stable, but sometimes undergoing important shifts. This was and remains a key point linking queer theory to feminism. We think we know what a woman is, what it means to be a woman. The society around us tells us what a woman is, or more often, what a woman should be. But then we find that those definitions can be too narrow, too restrictive, and we seek greater freedoms. We do that not just as individuals, but as people who are affected by cultural and social change, and who, as a result of those changes, become capable of making change, entering into social relations in order to make them more free, more equal, and more just. If we want to undertake a certain kind of work, or appear in a certain way, or love someone our family disapproves of, well, we may find that we risk no longer belonging to the category of gender that was originally assigned to us.
There it is.
Some of us then seize that category as an historical reality, as an historically changing construct, which means we are formed by it, but we also have the power to.
This is really important for people to understand Judith Butler's perspective, okay? She's talking about You were assigned an identity that was created for you. What she means was, Stony Baloney said it earlier, created for you by capitalism. The left believes, queer Marxists believe, that capitalism created the gender binary. The gender binary means men and women. They created it by putting men in the socially constructed roles where they were in the workplace, where they had access to all the power and all the money. They put women in the socially constructed roles of doing the unpaid labor of having and raising the nuclear family in the household. And by the way, the roles are almost entirely constructed around reproduction, which is why they're actually trying to decouple gender from reproduction right now. That's a whole other story, but that is actually happening and it's crazy. But the basis of what Judith believes and what I want people to understand is Judith does not believe that men and women are real. Judith believes that the genders of men and women are socially constructed constructs that were forced on us by capitalism. She doesn't believe that they're real. And yes, that system is called the patriarchy, where men are in the workplace, women are in the home, men have all the power and all the money, women do the unpaid labor. That is what the patriarchy is.
Proves of, well, we may find that we risk no longer belonging to the category of gender that was originally assigned to us. Some of us then seize that category as an historical reality, as an historically changing construct, which means we are formed by it, but we also have the power to form it anew, to change the category into a more livable one we can affirm,
like
and that affirms us.
Judith
but for others, the category has to be left behind, and new categories of gender must be created to make life more livable, to find a language and social world that we can affirm, and that affirms us as well. To be any identity at all involves an identification with a social category. That category has been produced by others. It comes to us with saturated historical meanings. And yet, our identification can intervene in that history, even opening up a different future. Identification and identity are not the same. Stuart Hall has said this. So has Jacqueline Rose. We do not close the gap between ourselves and the social category that defines us through identifying with the category. To identify with a category means there's a difference between oneself and the category.
Okay, so what she's saying there is to buy into the gender binary of men and women, to say you are a man or to say you are a woman, means you are identifying with capitalism. You are identifying with the categories that capitalism created for you. Judith is non-binary. Judith publicly identifies as non-binary. What that means is Judith has a refusal to acknowledge that men and women are actually real things. Non-binary means no binary. It is an argument against gender. It is an argument in favor of abolishing the categories of men and women entirely. Listen to that again.
The social category that defines us through identifying with a category. To identify with a category means there's a difference between oneself and the category. Identification names that gap, but so too does queer theory. We can identify with a category and say, yes, this is me, this category. Or we can disidentify with the categories imposed upon us. And that disidentification involves a negative or critical energy that is crucial for any effort to make the world anew. Jose Esteban Munoz knew this and wrote about disidentification as a queer theoretical construct. Similarly, we say, for instance, that we become our genders. And this proposition, drawn from the work of Simone de Beauvoir, is considered a defining characteristic of queer theory. And yet there is no straight path that defines that becoming. To become a gender is to undergo a series of deviations, to be part of a process that is open-ended and without teleology.